Cynthia Owyoung, it is so lovely to have you on the podcast today. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited about our conversation.
Likewise. So, you just wrote a book called All Are Welcome: How to Build a Real Workplace Culture of Inclusion That Delivers Results.
That's right. That book has been a year in the making, and I'm just so proud to have it out in the world right now.
It's really beautiful too. For those that are watching, I'm just going to show it. It's just an absolutely gorgeous book. And man, I just, as someone who just is working on publishing herself, your cover is really great.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much. We did have a few iterations to be able to get to that. So I'm really proud that it's in a place where people like it resonates with people.
It's really inviting, and I know how hard that is now.
There are so many books out there to do something kind of like different and original and standing out. Like it's really hard.
Yeah, it's like I don't know. I thought that writing the book was the hardest part, and then I got to that, and I was like, oh man, I wish somebody else could just do this for me.
I know. I learned so much doing this book. It's my first book ever. I had no idea what all goes into writing a book, let alone publishing it, and how many different steps there are, and all the lead time that it takes, and that it's more than just like turning in a manuscript, but making decisions about, your title, your cover design, right? The colors, the fonts. It's just there's so much more to it than you think. So it's definitely a labor of love.
I could not agree more. So I'm curious, can you tell listeners why this book and why now?
Great question. I think in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder in 2020, I think it just raised our collective consciousness about racial equity and social justice issues. I've been in this space for the last 20 years as a career, but that sort of groundswell that happened not just here in the US, but globally, was something I'd never seen before. And so a lot of companies were putting out statements around how they could do more to support racial justice in their workplaces. And we're looking for guidance and help. And so, a lot of people in the DEI space, like myself, were being reached out to for support and guidance and advice, right? And in that period, I kind of realized that I've always operated within, both small and some very large companies. And, my impact has been sort of scaled to the impact of those particular companies. But with this collective sort of racial reckoning that was happening, right, a book would give me the opportunity to actually scale my impact much farther than sort of what's within my kind of network, so to speak. So that was one of the key reasons for writing the book, and definitely it being sort of the right timing for it. Right, we're just a year and a half out from those events. A lot of companies are now being looked to for accountability to those commitments that they made, right, back in 2020. We're finding that for a few of them, that they're not actually doesn't seem to be much change. So, I think the book is really geared towards helping people to drive that change, both on an individual level, right? So it's not just about companies, it's about each of us,
Right.
Being part of that change. But also, how do we actually hold leaders of different organizations accountable to driving it? And so this book is really about providing a playbook for both.
I love that. And you've mentioned you've been in this industry for 20 years. You've done this work that is also very much a labor of love for 20 years. Can you talk about what spurred you personally to get into this work?
Oh yeah. So now we're going to go into like my personal story, right? Because
Please.
nobody, I don't know anybody who goes into DEI work without having a really deep personal connection to it in some way. And so mine comes from my family background. I think for anyone who visually can see me, right? You see that I'm an Asian woman. My parents are immigrants. I am the first generation born here in the US. And so I grew up with this very sort of like bicultural, one foot in two worlds kind of upbringing and conflict, frankly, within myself, that I had to learn how to navigate and resolve, right, as I grew up. And then, you layer on top of that the fact that one of my brothers is gay and the other brother is developmentally challenged. And so, I've had this like really sharpened sense of empathy for people who are treated as outside the norm.
Mm.
Right? Who aren't seen as like normal in some way, shape, or form. And I've always reacted against that, right? When I see people treating my disabled brother as somebody who's just not smart enough, not like capable enough, like can't do this job or that, right? And it's just, that makes me want to fight, right? It makes me want to correct for their perceptions or their biases that they're bringing to the table so that he can be seen for what he does have, what he does bring, right? And so, I've always had that kind of within me, but it didn't take until I was in grad school when I was reevaluating my, sort of next step in my career that I realized that this could be a career for me. I'd done 10 years in marketing jobs thinking that was going to be the place that was going to make my mark. But then ultimately I realized that it wasn't personally satisfying and fulfilling. So that's why I went to grad school. And then I took a diversity management course. And there was this woman who came from Toyota who had this type of job and talked about it. And I was just like, that's when the light bulb went off. And I thought, oh, you can actually like do this, like open people's opportunity and access to that opportunity, right? In a way that can be beneficial and win-win for the organization and for the individual. So, I was like, that's what I want to do. And that's how I'm going to apply all of that personal history and lessons learned into my work.
Oh, I love that so much. I love that. I was struck by that part of the book already. And I loved how you shared a little bit about your family background and what it was like growing up and not feeling like, hopefully I'm getting this correct, not feeling like there was any group that you fit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. That's I think I call myself a misfit in so many ways, but it's a good thing. I actually, when I was a kid, I never that wasn't part of how I defined myself in a positive way. But I've learned as I've grown older that's a differentiation, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes me unique and makes the perspective that I bring really valuable to people, right?
Absolutely.
So it's now I'm much more proud to define myself as a misfit, and because I can see how being different means you can be more creative, you can be more innovative, you can, help people see things that they didn't necessarily see before, and therefore like change and do things in a different way. So yeah, it's I think, not having that, kind of sense of like true belonging when I was younger has really helped me kind of step into this role of like helping to create belonging for others.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I don't outwardly look different, I don't think, from different groups that we are talking about. But I was made fun of a lot as a kid, and felt very othered, and maybe I othered myself, and that resonated deeply with me. Your part of the story resonated deeply with me. And I do think that becomes your special sauce as you get older. I do really think that that's part of, it's that place I draw on sometimes now for my creativity. It's the place I draw on for when I facilitate in groups, making sure I'm looking out for the person that feels othered in some way. And trying to make sure that there's space for everyone to be included. And I would not have that perspective if my grade school experience had been different.
Oh, I hear you on that one.
Ooh, man, I just get a little warm thinking about it.
I know, exactly. And I think, Alisha, you also raise a really good point that I think a lot of people actually miss about this work, because very often they think that, it's not about them, right? It's not about you, especially if you identify as somebody or is perceived as identifying as it within a majority group, right? But the reality is, like, we can't make progress in this space. We can't achieve this sort of like, ideal of a society where everyone is treated equitably, right, and fairly across the board, and everyone has equal access to opportunity without support from people who are in the majority, right? And so the work is just as much about me as it is about you, because at some point, right, everyone has felt the impact of being excluded.
Yeah.
Right, of not feeling like they belong, whether it is being teased for who you are in grade school for an extended period of time, or not getting chosen to be on the basketball team, right, or whatever that might be. I think we've all had that human experience, and so much of what I try to help people understand is that we all play a role in creating a different experience of belonging for people. And so, I think each of us can do that and has a responsibility to do that.
I couldn't agree with you more. There is an acronym that you use, DEIB. And, I spent a decade in corporate America before I ventured out to start my own business. And I've done a little bit of work with groups that use the acronym DEI. And the B was new to me. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, so what I'm referring to is diversity, equity, inclusion, and then the B stands for belonging, right?
That's right.
Can you talk about that?
For sure. I think when I started in this work 20 years ago, this whole field has evolved quite a bit, right? When I started, it was sort of just about diversity. And diversity, as it was defined, was more about like affirmative action here in the US. Right. That's what people kind of like felt it was all about. It was like about like potentially like, are you asking me to like, fulfill a quota? Right. Is this just about representation? And I think, what we've learned, over the years is that you can have diversity, but if they're not included, then it's sort of a moot point, right? Like if they're not going to thrive in the organization and ultimately leave. So that's why inclusion started to come into the mix, where people started to realize that having people from different backgrounds who are really included in a team could lead to things like greater creativity, higher innovation, better financial performance, better decision making, all these great things and reasons why companies are engaging in this work today. And then, what we started to realize is that D&I wasn't enough. You had to add in the E for equity, because that's kind of the outcome, right? Like we have to be really explicit about like some of the whole reason, the whole purpose behind driving these things. It isn't just about, better decisions, but it's also about making sure that we have equitable outcomes for people in promotion, in hiring, in some of those like concrete things that are tangible impacts to a career, right? And then what we also saw over the last few years is this idea of, okay, like I can like achieve those things like diversity. I can bring people into the company. I can provide equitable opportunities. I can create an environment where they feel like they're included. But they're not staying, right? Like that's not enough. They have to feel that strong sense of connection to the company, whether that's connection to whoever manages you, to the team of people that you work with, right? To the way that the company operates, right? Like you have to have this sense of like authenticity of being accepted for who you are, to feel this strong sense of belonging, right? And that's why belonging really has come in, because I think it's recognizing that we need to be who we are as individuals, and we want who we are to be accepted, right? And that's going to drive like loyalty and increased effort, right? Like I'm going to give you more if I really think that you believe in me and what I bring, right? So all of these things are part of why I think belonging has been a necessary add to the mix.
Yeah, I love that. And it makes so much sense from when we look at it, but I don't think it's necessarily something that all companies are thinking about.
I agree.
Even now.
I know, because it's this sort of this like, a mushy concept, right? So it's I think it's hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around, especially if many folks, like their markers of success, right, are things are around like hardcore kind of metrics driven accomplishments, right? Like I delivered 1,000 widgets and I reached like 10 million people, right? I mean, people listen to this podcast, right? Like how many listeners do I have today, right? But like, bringing them in and engaging them and drawing them into the conversation to the point where they're active participants or active listeners, right? And really digesting like that's the belonging piece, right? Like you're creating belonging with your audience in this space. And so again, I think that that's part of what drives meaning for people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's, with this podcast specifically, I'm always hoping that the episodes make those listening feel seen, heard, and loved. Like that to me is the measure of success. Is, did it connect? Did it tell a story that resonated? Did it make you want to go look something up or read something new? So that belonging piece feels really innately important to the work that I do. And this kind of segues into the next thing. I have a background, I spent a decade in the financial sector. So, which I know that you are passionate about, and you went from tech to the financial sector to do this work. And I had to tell you a story. So I'm not going to name where I worked, but I worked at an insurance company that was over 100 years old. And I went from a high-end grocery store to this insurance company. And my background, I went to a liberal arts college. And the liberal arts college that I went to, diversity equity and inclusion was at the forefront of everything they did. And it felt like a place where everyone was different, but came together with core values. And to go from a place that is that unique and more inclusive than other places, and then be thrown into the financial sector. I remember in 2000, it was 2007, it was January, it was our sales conference. I was up in Philadelphia for this sales conference. And I'm looking around at a room of probably at least 1,000 people, if not more. And I remember thinking, okay, there's a lot of white men in suits, and there's very few women, and I see only a handful of people of color. I like felt like I had been dropped into another universe. And it was like an out of body experience, to be honest, of just looking around thinking like something is just not right here. And I knew it then, and I didn't know what to do about it. And I didn't know how I could make a difference. So I was very, very curious to hear more about your story of like how you went into the financial sector and how you decided that's where you wanted to make a difference.
It's a interesting question that I think, has sort of several facets of an answer to. So, I wasn't actually looking to get into the financial services sector, but this opportunity came along. And honestly, at first, I was just like, yeah, no.
I get why.
Every sort of image I had, right, of the financial services sector was basically what you just outlined. Right. And so I didn't really, have any desire to go into it. But then it just so happened that I had a friend who was already working in financial services who really sort of opened my eyes to the possibility. And so I took a chance and I was like, all right, let me talk to some more people about what it means to do this, right? To go in, to be a DEI person within financial services. And, what I learned was that there's so much opportunity there, right? And if I wanted to make a bigger difference, that was a really great channel to do that. And what I also learned was once I started to get into it, you then realize like how much financial services drives everything that we do. So, and I'm a big believer, like I know that social justice doesn't come without economic justice. And so, what being in financial services as an industry allows me to kind of like spread that impact that I can have in so many different ways. Like you look at companies like State Street and the change that they've affected on boards of directors across hundreds of companies, if not thousands by now, right? Because I think as of a couple of years ago, they basically said, hey, you need to have more women on your boards, right? So we're not going to invest in you unless you have more women on your boards, to the point where they had like 826 of the companies that they work with, like actually have women got added to their boards. And that's a significant number, right? Like that's like driving change at a massive level. And, and I think about like, investors who are thinking about where do I invest my money? And, how can investing in companies that are more socially responsible, that care about diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, right? That are going to be companies that actually yield them, greater returns. And so you can influence investing behavior and where that money goes and where companies choose to focus, right? Through that, being a shareholder. And there's just, those are just two examples of the way that money makes the world go round.
It really, really does. It really does.
Yeah. And so that's why I think being in financial services and making changes in this industry can have immense ripple effects across a lot of different places. And so that's the other reason why, for me, it was really important to go into this space.
Well, I really appreciate those stories. And I want to just back up for a second for those that might not know what State Street is. State Street is, they are mutual funds, right? Is that right? A mutual funds company? Or
Yes, they have they basically manage assets, right? So
yeah, the company that I work for, we used a lot of State Street in those products. So so what you're saying is they, if I'm getting this correct, I didn't know this happened, they demanded basically that the companies that they were working with or were investing in
mhm.
have more women on their boards.
Yeah, so
Wow.
you might not know. So do you remember the Fearless Girl statue
Yeah,
that was placed in
yeah,
front of the New York Stock Exchange a number of years back? So
yes.
State Street was the company, the investing company that sponsored that campaign, right?
Wow.
Yeah, and they did that, like, they placed her in front of the bull, right, in front of on Wall Street, right, to make a statement about how women were, basically historically marginalized in the investing community. But we also know that women control a huge number of assets in society today. And so, it was part of that campaign was sort of bringing to light, right, the need for more women equality in both like the investing side and the investor side, right?
Mm.
And so as part of that campaign, they made a concerted effort to say to the companies that they were investing in that you really needed to have more women on your boards in support of this, right? And so that's how they got more and more companies to do it.
That is a very powerful story. Thank you for sharing that. I didn't realize that that any of those things had happened aside from the girl standing in front of the
Right.
bull.
Right. Yeah.
Very
Yeah. It's
neat.
a great example of how we can drive change if we're willing to make those kinds of statements. Right.
Yeah, it I'm get really excited about companies like Ellevest that are focused on more marginalized communities like women investors. And I'm really fascinated by how is her, I think her last name Crenshaw, Sally Crenshaw, is that how it's pronounced? Do you know?
Sally Krawcheck.
Krawcheck. I'm
Mhm.
fascinated by how when she did that, she didn't just open that company, she bought a community too. So
Yes.
she bought, I forget what the community was called before, but there was this community for women that was about networking and breaking glass ceilings. And she invested in that community because it is also through community in which things change. And I'm fascinated. I'm curious if you have any stories in the book about how community within companies helps impact uh, DEIB work.
Oh, so many good examples. I think probably the most salient one is the use of employee resource groups, or, what some companies might call in affinity groups, and have now evolved into sort of many companies will call them like business resource groups, which are
Mhm.
basically employee communities inside the companies that are built around or created around a shared characteristic, right? So it could be, a women's group, could be you often find groups that are built around like ethnicity, so a Black community group or a Latinx community group. They can also be built around disability, like different characteristics or dimensions of diversity. And these are like communities that are typically employee driven, meaning you've got a group of people who often feel like they're isolated, marginalized in small numbers, and who are like, you know what, I need to go find my people. I need support. I need people who I can share my experiences with, where they're not going to react with a surprise, right? And so you see these groups form primarily around that initial need of like providing support to each other, so that people don't feel isolated and they can get that sense of belonging, right, inside a company beyond their immediate teams. And that's how they really help to drive change in this space, right? Because you feel like you're not alone, right? You have a group of people that you can draw on, that you have these shared affinities with, and there can also be more strength in numbers. So if you're not the only one saying, I'm having this experience of marginalization inside the company, but there's like 10 other people who are saying the same things, you're more likely to have that voice heard at the highest levels of the company to be able to drive something different in the future.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why I think community is super important.
Yeah. I do recall that happening when I left the insurance company I was with. I recall like there's some affinity groups that were really strong. And specifically the women's group was very strong. And the thing that I found so interesting is I'm seeing now that there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of pushback in that folks are asking, why aren't these supported more by the companies themselves? And I'm curious what's problematic about it being supported by the company, and what is beneficial what happens when it can be supported more, like made a paid time investment to those that are the leadership and things like that.
Yeah, there's definitely pros and or I don't know, cons, that it's not depending on your point of view, right? So I think, you know, when we talk about companies really supporting ERGs, you get so much benefit from that, in terms of now ERGs actually have like process or infrastructure, right? Budgets, funding to do activities, right? That they can be seen as leadership development pools, where people who lead different parts of or functions within ERGs can then get higher consideration for promotion, or that next like leadership development opportunity, or seen as like high potential talent that others want to invest in, right? And obviously you're the more sort of integrated you are into the fabric of a organization's culture, the more that you're looked to, right, to help shape it, right? And so you can advocate for the company to take a stand on a particular like a human rights issue, or an LGBTQ issue, or legislation that might be harmful to a particular community or group, right? And so you can get incredible support in that sense. I think the trade-off for that can be, for some folks, can be sort of a lessened sense of autonomy, as an example, right? So once you get sort of some of that company support, especially in terms of like budget and oversight, then you're accountable to it. Right. And for some people that can be really stressful, especially if you're really just there to like build the community and have that belonging, and you don't really want it to kind of spill over into some of those other things, right? So I think there's a necessary balance that needs to be struck, in terms of kind of what the company is trying to accomplish and how much they leverage their ERGs to do that versus what the people within the ERGs actually want.
Mm, that
right?
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And there can be like good alignment there, right? But it's just about making sure that there is alignment and that no one is sort of imposing a directive, right, on the ERGs, because that would not be a good way to get people to be motivated to support your overall objectives, right?
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I'm also curious, we have so many listeners that are solopreneurs, entrepreneurs, teams of one that do every job within the company and the community. And I know that the listeners of this podcast, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, they are important to those that are listening. And I know that sometimes as a solopreneur myself, it can feel like, well, how do I do that? How do I make sure that that's still on the forefront of our mind? Because I do think that if someone's going to grow, or even if you're not going to grow beyond one, I still think it's important to be thinking about. And I'm wondering if you can give us any ways to frame how we think about it and any actionable steps we could take.
Absolutely. I think, no person is an island, right? Even though you're running your own business and you're working for yourself, you work with other people, right? You choose who to have on your podcast, right? So you have agency and ability to make decisions that can help to drive change in these spaces by looking at showcasing and amplifying more marginalized voices as a core example, right? Anyone who is in doing their own sort of entrepreneurial endeavor, right? Like you're probably needing to like get supplies or use vendors for things. And so actually thinking about like where you're spending your money in those respects, right? Are you spending it with my minority owned suppliers or, with big conglomerates, right? Like, it's kind of the same thing that each of us can do every day in sort of the whole like buy local, be sustainable. Like we all can make a difference in those kinds of ways. We think about like, are we supporting marginalized communities? Are we amplifying those voices? When I look at my social networks, right? Do I have diversity within that? And when I think about like the things that I retweet out or share out, right? Like again, who am I amplifying?
Yeah.
So we can all make those choices and be thoughtful about it. Even when I got to just like buy gifts for people in my circle, right? And oftentimes like it'll be thank you gifts for people who are supporting my sort of side hustles, which I'm very much a solopreneur.
You don't write a book if you're not a solopreneur, right?
Exactly. So, I do the things like that with an eye towards, okay, so, am I buying it from, this product from a supplier that, has a commitment statement around diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Is sourcing from a globally underrepresented group or country or, things like that. Like we can all make those kinds of choices and drive change.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm wondering if there are any other stories from the book that you would like to share with us that I might not have highlighted.
Good question. I think the only other area that we haven't covered is probably just how uncomfortable the space is.
Glad you said that.
Yeah, for so many people, and I'm a big proponent of just like coming out and acknowledging it, right? Like, I recognize
that.
Do it again, Alisha?
You should have led with that.
I think if you think about like why we don't lead with that, right? Like, I mean, that's the whole reason, this is hard. It's hard for people to engage in conversations. And I so often, get questions from people about like, oh, like, how do I refer to people? What language do I use? Like, how I want to learn about a particular topic, but I don't want to like burden somebody with teaching me, right? Like, and I don't want to accidentally offend somebody, right? If I, want to engage about a particular issue. And all valid, right? We all feel what we feel. And this is an uncomfortable topic for many folks because it can be so personal. And I think the key for me, or what I would share with folks is that it's some of it is about accepting that, right? Recognizing that whenever you do something new, it's gonna be uncomfortable, right? We all learn how to walk by falling down when we were babies. And so, here you're going to fall down too. And, I, even after 20 years in this space, I will put my foot in my mouth pretty consistently. And so nobody's going to be perfect because I think the field continues to evolve. B, everyone is different. And what might be okay for one person won't be okay for another, right? There's no one size fits all. But I think the key here is to try, to practice, to get more comfortable with trying and practicing and getting it wrong. And asking, like, and getting educated. I think we have opportunities to use the internet, which is amazing, to get different perspectives and do research on different topics. And then, actually put that into practice, right? Where we can, reach out to somebody who may be different from ourselves and be like, hey, I'm trying to learn about this. I'm going to be really genuine about not knowing what I don't know, right? And would love to hear kind of your perspective or opinion, or even just like as simple as like, what pronoun do you use? Right? So I can refer to you correctly. Like there's so many different small ways that people can get past that discomfort, but it starts with like actually like being intentional about doing that.
Yeah, that's so helpful. And it makes me think, so the book that I'm publishing in May is called Little Failures. And it's about the importance of failing and having little failures along the way so that we don't make bigger failures. And you're reminding me of that, in that I think one of the things that I found in my research is that the pain of failure is actually important, because that is how we learn and how we remember. And I think about the times in this space where I've gotten it wrong, and I've gotten it wrong a lot. And I think, as most of us do, and that feeling of like, oh, I don't want to hurt someone. I don't want to center myself. I don't want, like all of those thoughts that you start having. That is where the learning is happening. So that pain and that uncomfortableness is actually the place where it's the starting point. And so thank you so much for bringing that up, because it's a wonderful reminder and point. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, I think it's just important to be open and honest about it.
Right? Absolutely. Well, is there anything else you would like to share with us today?
It's been such a lovely conversation, Alisha. Thank you for allowing me to kind of spew my point of view to all of your listeners. I just hope that this piques their interest to just, learn something new, try something different, right? Ask, about a DEIB topic that maybe they hadn't really thought about before. And I would encourage folks to, just start by getting educated. And, that could be reading my book. That could be like doing some other search on the internet, or listening to a different podcast, or what have you. Right. But just get started.
Oh, thank you. And we will be linking to your book in the show notes, so listeners can go find it there. And the last question I have for you then is, how do you live a life of abundance?
I really believe that giving, it will result in receiving, right? So the more that I give of myself out into the world to make a positive difference, I feel like that always comes back tenfold in abundance for me, from, you know, either the friendships that I make, or the fulfillment that I feel from watching people actually achieve their aspirations, right? When maybe a door was closed to them before. So that's really how I feel like I live that life of abundance, and I gather it to me because I give of myself out, right? And always with a positive intent, because I think positivity begets positivity. So that's how I live that.
Thank you for sharing, and thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the thoughtful questions.